right, so we're now recording.
Josh, I'm sorry. I think there's still some feedback.
Minimize meeting. Virtual
Yeah, let's make sure everyone is muted here. Okay, here. Okay, I found it. Okay, there we go. So now there's no feedback, and we're gonna get started. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining our second live edition of This Week in Birding. I am co-host. I'm Josh Engel from Red Hill Birding, and my co-host is Bob Dolgan, who's the founder of Turnstone Impact and the filmmaker of the fantastic documentary that many of you have seen, Monty and Rose. And before we get started with our program, Bob is going to share the exciting Monty and Rose news that we all found out about yesterday. So Bob, why don't you take it away for a second?
Yeah. Thanks, Josh. So for those who aren't in Chicago or about 10 minutes from the lakefront, as I am, we had an amazing story unfold here last year, and that is the first piping plover nest in the city since 1955. And those plovers were nicknamed Monty and Rose, and they flew south for the winter and returned here on May 1st of this year to an empty beach. Our lakefront is closed right now due to the pandemic. So, but wildlife officials and others have been checking up on Monty and Rose, and we just found out yesterday that they have scraped a nest, and there are 3 eggs. There are 3 eggs in that nest as of as far as I know, late yesterday or early today. So it's really exciting. Just as the story continues to unfold. From what I heard about the nest, it's in a different section of the beach. If people know Montrose Point, it's in the Montrose Beach Dunes enclosed area, closer to the fishing pier. So there might be some risks with flooding. However, I think it's just a moment to celebrate. So we're excited, and Monty and Rose with another year of experience under their belt, we hope that they'll be successful again this year. So just exciting news, and talk about it's one of the highlights in recent birding news. I'd say it just happened, so we thought we would share that.
Yeah. And there had been no news for quite some time. So yeah. I think people, including me, we were getting a little bit nervous about this. So.
Yeah, I was wondering too. It was like a couple of weeks of silence there.
Yeah. Well, I want to welcome our esteemed guests today. We have two scientists, 2 birders who have studied extensively bird migration, especially in the Midwest. So we're in for a real treat here. We're with Alison Vilag, who is up in Whitefish Point, which is one of the really great migration hotspots, birding hotspots in all of the Midwest. It's also a place where there's a lot of bird research that goes on. It's on the Lake Superior shore of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Alison's been there for the last 3 migrations as the water bird counter. So counting ducks, loons, grebes, shorebirds that come by, counting them individually one by one to get ideas of population trends. And she's part of a long-term monitoring program that's been going on there for over 40 years. She's from Southwest Michigan. She's worked on another famed Michigan bird, Kirtland's Warbler, as a guide, and also doing active conservation work. She's also worked for the Illinois Natural History Survey, so a lot of the people are probably from the Chicago area, and she actually was a technician for the Natural History Survey in Cook and Lake County. And by great coincidence, while she was doing that, she lived in the same apartment building on the north side of Chicago. And we're also joined with Brad Bumgardner, who is the executive director of Indiana Audubon Society and the founder and chair of the Indiana Dunes Birding Festival, as well as the founder of the Indiana Dunes Longshore Count, migration count, which is one thing that we're going to focus talking on today. Right now, he is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He has the nicest background of anybody here. If you hear any gulls calling, it's probably not inside your house. It's probably in the background of Brad's video and audio. He's a graduate of Purdue University, and he was at one time the head naturalist of the Department of Natural Resources at Indiana Dunes State Park. So thank you so much for being here, Allison and Brad.
Thanks for having us.
And yeah, absolutely. And thanks everyone for coming. So we're just going to be asking Allison and Brad some questions and hearing their perspective on various topics related to their work. If you have questions, we have the chat open. So please go in the chat, put some comments on, you can add comments, you can add questions, and we'll get to your questions at the end. We have Amanda Ziegler here, who's going to be helping moderate the questions when we get to the end later in the program. So I'm going to start with Brad because just about a week ago today, more or less, or almost on May 15th, he witnessed one of these great migration spectacles that everyone dreams of seeing at one time or another on the Indiana Dunes Longshore Count. Brad, can you tell us what happened? I think it was May 15th, so just over a week.
Yeah, it was May 15th, and of course, to talk about that, I got to give a little bit of an introduction that where we sit at our count is on almost the southern tip of Lake Michigan. So if you look at the exact southern tip, that's Miller Beach, and so we're about 8 miles east of Miller Beach. And so it's a great location to get this pileup effect that occurs. And as most of you guys know, we've spent the first half of May that was in a real kind of a rut of a north or an east wind. And so it finally kind of unleashed, and we had this unbottling of a south wind that occurred, and it was coupled with a rain event. And one of the things that's really of big interest to me is not only studying the migration, but how it's affected by geography and weather events. And so we have a perfect combination of these high dunes to be able to watch birds migrating, and then this storm system that came through really late in the night. So it looked like it was going to come earlier, but the storms didn't come to almost midnight. So we had a really heavy flight of birds that arrived into the dunes, and then the rain stopped right after dawn. So we had this huge event of birds that were continuing their migration past dawn. And I myself was back farther in the park, and I thought with some of the rain that maybe there wouldn't be a big movement of birds. And I was receiving multiple texts last Friday saying, basically, get your butt to the tower. You know, we were farther back in the park, and, you know, we were hearing lots of different warblers that were in, and we were able to arrive up there. It was about an hour after sunrise, and what we had going on was a massive warbler flight that had occurred overnight that was continuing into the morning, and it was really tough conditions. It was really cloudy, and we were hearing a lot of chips, and you could see literally 3,000 to 5,000 warblers in the first couple hours of the morning were flying by, anywhere from eye level to 100 or 200 feet in the air. And so it was just like I heard it described as a sensory overload to try to identify all these species as they're flying by left and right. And we had a great team up there that just kind of happened to fall together that morning to be able to help identify them, to produce several state records, most notably. And I heard later in the day from a lot of folks that were out birding, whether you were in the Northwest Indiana or Chicago region, seeing a Cape May warbler last Friday. And the previous record for Cape May warblers in the Indiana Dunes was 15 birds. And we ended up with 202 logged Cape May warblers. And I haven't checked the records around the entire Great Lakes region, but I suspect that's going to be a really large record that we may not find other sites that have hit that, at least in the spring, compared to maybe some of the sites that do fall counts on the East Coast. But not only the Cape May warblers, but we had, I think it was 4 species that broke state records that day, and another 4 species that broke dune area records. So it was actually, I heard a birder that a lot of folks know, Caleb Putnam. He actually said in the middle of the morning, it was like 8 a.m., saying, "This is the best birding day of my life." And I don't know how many times people can actually get a chance to say that, and just to hear them utter that just kind of reminded me just how impressive and what a sight that we were witnessing that morning.
Yeah, and one thing about people who do these counts, you and Allison and all the other people that you've talked about, it's an amazing skill to be able to identify these little birds that are zipping by 1,000,000 miles an hour. So to get these counts really takes a lot of skill. And the fact is, you probably end up with a lot of unidentified birds too, because they are going so fast. And that just comes with the territory, right?
Yeah, and I'd say we identified we were guessing 5 to 10% of the warblers actually flew by. Most of them went past us, and I would say without Caleb's help that day, it probably would have been even lower. Which, this is a lot of people that do these counts. It's not for everybody. It's not only the skill level, but it's a sedentary type of birding. And so for a lot of folks, it's just not their cup of tea. They'd rather be out walking around. And so it's not only being able to identify birds on the fly as they're going by in midair, as they're quickly landing in trees, but then Caleb has a special skill as a photographer to be able to just click, 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 get pictures of birds flying by, and then just as quickly look at his view screen, zoom in, and get an ID on that bird, and then just as fast, click, click, click. And so a lot of the birds were being ID'd that way as well.
You hinted on this in your last answer, but why is that place so special? Why is that place such a good spot to see this sort of migration? Because Chicago is just pretty nearby, and we don't see anything really like that at all. It's only to a much smaller extent.
That's what's amazing is that you can go 30 miles in one direction and not see the same thing. And what we have going on at the Indiana Dunes is being on the southern tip of the lake. You have this amazing resource. That's Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan is both an obstacle and a resource for birds. And as they're flying up from the south, they basically, a migrating bird is seeing Lake Michigan and saying, oh crap. And they have to come down and they have to land, refuel, or they will move parallel to the lakefront. And by having the high dunes as well, we are on a 80-foot sand dune with a 20-foot tower. So we have just this ultimate view of the birds that are migrating by. And there is a lot of nocturnal flight that's occurring. And the night flight, most people don't realize how many birds are migrating at night that we don't witness. And we've had special radars up at our tower that show literally lots more birds that are going by than we might normally see in the daytime. And once dawn comes, it's probably about 5 to 10% of what the nocturnal flight was. Mm-hmm. But we're still capturing that. These birds are continuing their northward migration. Some of them are actually out over Lake Michigan at dawn, and they're coming back. Yeah. So we have birds literally moving in every single direction from the top.
Pretty amazing. I've got a picture up here of the tower.
Yeah, and there you can see, you're standing in what we call the Indiana Dunes State Park West Lot. And then we climb up that dune top, and then you get up on that tower, which used to sit as a water tower. They tore that down as the state park went they connected to the town of Porter's water system, didn't need that water tower. And once it was finally gone, well, that's when the birder was like, wait a second, we used that tower. And really, this is kind of a late thing that we didn't discover until the last decade or two. Yeah. What an amazing spot that was, because originally that area was used to watch hawks. And then somebody was sitting closer to the lake and said, guys, there's a lot of these other birds that are moving too. And that's really kind of what kickstarted this, what we call the Longshore Count.
Yeah. That's a great story. That's really amazing. Brad, I'm going to keep you muted because of the background noise. So maybe you can unmute yourself when I ask you more questions, or when you want to pipe up. Yeah, there we go. So Alison, I'm going to go, with Brad, I just started with something that happened a week ago, but I want to go back a little bit farther with you first to hear about your history with Whitefish Point. I know you started going there quite a long time ago. Can you tell us about some of your earlier memories of visiting Whitefish?
Yeah, for sure. So I started birding when I was 6 and grew up in southwestern Michigan. And Whitefish Point Bird Observatory was actually my first birding trip away from southwest Michigan. So it stands out in my memory for that reason. It was 2001 when I went there, and I was 8. And I think it was late April or early May. I can't remember which exactly. But there were a lot of redneck grebes and common loons. And at Whitefish Point, we have the hawk deck because in spring we have a hawk count. And at night, if you go there around dusk, if you're lucky, you can see owls lifting out of the pines and migrating across the lake. It's a really cool facet of migration here that a lot of people don't think of because it's not as obvious as the hawk count or the waterbird count. But my mom and I went out there, and it was really cold, and I was really cold, so we left. And the next day we went back to Whitefish Point and found out that other people had seen a great gray owl very shortly after we had left. And I was really disappointed. But I was really resolute too. I was a pretty stubborn kid. And so that night we went back out, and I knew that I was going to be cold, but I decided that it wasn't going to affect me. And I was cold and we waited, and the great gray came back, or another great gray, I don't know which it was. And so it was dusk, and the lighthouse beam was going around in circles, and it was so cool because the owl would illuminate in the lighthouse beam, and it was just really incredible.
That's really amazing. You know, having that history there, going back to when you were a kid, that must make it even more special and meaningful that you're the counter there now.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, my partner just got here and is waving at the window. But anyway, it is really amazing to be back here. This place I have a lot of history at. In fact, after I moved out of Chicago, I came back to the Eastern Upper Peninsula for about a month and asked if I could relief count for the fall waterbird count, and that's sort of how I got my foot back in the door here. But every day I'm out here, I consider it a privilege to be contributing to the research database at a place where it's just been very meaningful for me.
Yeah, and Brad alluded to this with the people like you who do these counts, that, you know, it can be a solitary existence. It can take a lot of patience. It can be a lot of boredom between really exciting things. You know, how do you deal with being up there alone, sometimes in the cold, in those sorts of conditions?
I think a lot of it does go back to my personal stubbornness and determination. I like the satisfaction you get here from feeling like you've earned the birds. Every great migration event, every uncommon sighting that you have, you always feel like you deserved it, because there are those long, brutal hours where it's windy, or 8 hours of 38-degree rain, but you have a shorebird fallout. Even today, it was a really slow day in the afternoon because it was just warm and sunny, and we're nearing the end of the season. And I felt like I was scanning more out of a sense of duty than because I actually thought that I was going to see anything. And in the last hour of the count, I had a parasitic Jaeger fly by, which was our first Jaeger of the spring season. So yeah. I felt very rewarded.
That's great. Is this, so I've got this picture up here, is that a good representation of the experience of where you are when you're counting up there?
Yeah, it is, except there's no precipitation in that picture, so it's not entirely accurate. But yeah, we're out, the waterbird count takes place out on the end of this wood-swept point, and you just really feel like you're at Land's End. It's 16 miles across from Whitefish Point to Botchawana Bay, Ontario. And for some of the same reasons that Indiana Dunes is such a good migration concentration spot, those also apply to Whitefish Point.
I was going to ask a question about, I know Brad, your colleague Kyle Wichter, gets up at about, 5 every morning to get up to the tower. How about Alison? Like, what time do you, and also that it's like every single day, and you're starting, and I saw some of your pictures with snow, this is day in, day out, like starting, and not even spring. It's basically starting in winter and going just for so many days on end. I'm just amazed that you guys get out of bed and do this for that many days in a row.
Yeah. Alison, you don't start right at the crack of dawn, right? Because waterbirds get a little later start.
Oh no, that's a luxury that the hawk counter has, but I do not have that. Actually, a lot of our focal species migrate at night, so not only do we get up at dawn, the protocol for the count is it starts at sunrise and it goes for 8 hours. But in May, we usually have some really nice evening flights as well. So it's like you're nearing the end of the season, you're exhausted. May is, we all know, is a month where you don't get a lot of sleep just because there's so many birds to see. But I have been finding that energy and motivation every night to get out there and bird for about an hour and a half before sunset. And I've been rewarded with white-winged scoters. I had over 300 in about an hour and a half last night. And it's just amazing. You're standing out there. I don't count at the shack during the night flight. I actually go out to the tip where land meets water. And the birds are just rushing by on their way north. And you can just feel the urgency in the movement as you're standing there.
Yeah. What are the you mentioned focal species. What are those focal species?
There are quite a few. The count actually started with an emphasis on loons, and now it's extended to loons, grebes, swans, geese, ducks, shorebirds, gulls, terns, cranes, herons.
Yeah. Anything
Basically,
that,
any bird that's associated with the water, like any bird that if it lands in the water, it's probably going to be okay. That's
yeah,
the birds
and
we
you
deal
got
with at
great
the water
sites of
bird
all
count.
those. So, Brad, yours is really different. You know, Allison's counting these water birds. You guys in Indiana are counting, well, songbirds and anything that's basically smaller birds, woodland birds. Do you guys have focal species? Are there species that over the years of doing the count you have come to particularly focus on?
There are a few things that we look at specifically. What I don't want you to do is tell Kyle any of this, because Kyle's basically serving the role of like what 4 counters might be doing. So he might want more money because yeah, he's doing songbirds, he's doing water birds, especially early season, March and April, and then there is a hawk flight, and a couple of things that we really though are highly interested in. One is Sandhill Cranes. As we know, there's a heavy funneling migration that's occurring south of us in the KQ River, and we're seeing upwards to 30,000 Sandhill Cranes that get logged every year flying over the tower site. So it really shows, if you look at the eastern population of Sandhill Cranes, that's about 100,000 birds. So a third of this entire subspecies population is utilizing the Indiana Dunes in its migration route. If that doesn't talk about the importance of the southern tip of Lake Michigan and the Indiana Dunes for bird migration, I don't know what other species does. But obviously songbirds, so some of the neotropic warblers, blue jays are an amazing flight that occurs there. Some daily counts over 7,000 birds that will fly by. And so really some of those heavily moving songbird species are those that are counted most often. Loons, as she mentioned at Whitefish Point, are of interest. Unfortunately, it's a species that we've seen declining in some of our spring counts. We're not getting the hundreds of them that we used to get. Though interestingly, in the last decade or so, there's been an increase in red-throated loons that are now wintering and moving through the southern Great Lakes area too. So interesting is that we cover this whole gamut of a lot of different species all through one counter, which makes it really difficult for him that he's having to count all these different species. But it ebbs and flows with the status of the season. Different things that he's doing early in the season, and then as we get to April and May, he's doing more of the raptors later. And so it's kind of fun striking that balance.
And what are the typical dates that the count runs?
So for the Indiana Dunes, we began almost March 1st. So in that first week of March, he's out there. And that's when you got the really heavy icterid flights. So the redwings and the grackles with robins, hornlark are moving through. And then he will finish up usually just the days after Memorial Day weekend. So we're also wrapping up our season with just Flycatcher. Cedar Waxwings post a really interesting late flight as well. And they'll peak out right now. Some counts we've had over 18,000 in a day for just Cedar Waxwings moving. And so we'll kind of wrap those up. And by June 1st, we're usually done, though migration might linger on for a few extra days for folks finding things like olive-sideds and yellow-bellied flycatchers, but then our count is done. So what we kind of joke around is that we'll start with frostbite and we end up with a sunburn by the time we're done.
Yeah. And when you say you're talking about Kyle Wichter, right? He's been counter up there for a few seasons now.
So our paid counter for the first 5 years was just an amazing birder, Brendan Grube, who's still in the area. And then this is the 3rd season that Kyle Wichter has been doing the count for us.
Yeah, it's great, that there's these opportunities for funding for people to be paid to do these important jobs to monitor bird populations. Alison, you've pointed out that, it can be really hard to survey on the breeding grounds for some of these things. So that adds an added importance, and today, of course, a lot of birders use eBird to log their sightings. Anyone can go out with their phone and keep track of what they're seeing. So what do you see as the importance, in this day of so much citizen science? What's the importance of a count like Whitefish Point's?
I think that the importance of a count like Whitefish Point is the standardization. You're out there for a set amount of time, and you have the same observer over the course of a season. Hopefully you have a similar level of observer throughout the different seasons that you're running the count. And just being out there consistently and counting everything consistently is going to give you a more standardized data set than somebody who goes out in eBirds and does a good job with their list, records everything, but might not be able to be out there for 8 hours a day every day for 6 weeks or 3 months or however long your season is.
Yeah. And do you know what trends have been found over the 40 plus years of data? Is there anything that stands out to you in the data?
So we actually need to take a better look at our data, and that's something that I would like to take on if funding becomes available for it, just because we have this wealth of data.
Yeah.
But during the season, we're usually all too tired to do anything with it other than just record it and make sure that it gets put into the database. We have noticed, interestingly enough, to align with what Brad was saying, we have been having increasing numbers of red-throated loons on the count, and common loons have been decreasing. Some of that has been correlated with botulism outbreaks in the Great Lakes. Sandhill cranes have been increasing a lot, and I have noticed, I need to actually look at the data, but just from my observations from the last 2 springs here and comparing them with the bar graphs, it looks like migration peak dates have moved up about a week. So they're happening about a week earlier in the season for a lot of species.
And I guess you might expect that with a warming climate that birds would be migrating a little earlier. That's really interesting. And you guys use a special program for counting, which is really amazing. I was playing around yesterday. Can you tell us about that? It's really cool. Anyone can watch it, right?
Yeah, so we use this program called Dunkadoo, and I had never heard of it before I started at Whitefish Point. The name is not really apparent, but it's for one of the folk names of American bittern related to its call. And it's really nice because it allows us to not rely on paper and pen out in the field, and Whitefish Point field conditions are really rough on paper and pen and other things like your face and your mental well-being as well. But the other really cool thing about Dunkadoo is that we bring out a wireless hotspot with it and record it on a tablet, and this allows us to have a live feed going. So anybody that's interested in what's happening with the count, no matter where they are, they can follow along and see what we're seeing as it's being recorded. And I think that this has been really helpful this season, particularly with a lot of our point regulars unable to come up because of travel restrictions. They've been letting me know that they've been following on Dunkadoo. So a lot of bird observatories are starting to use it. I know that Hawk Ridge uses Dunkadoo. There's a count in Mexico that uses it, so it's not just North American specific.
And what's the website that people would go to be able to follow along?
So the one for Whitefish Point, I think if you just Google Dunkadoo and Whitefish Point Bird Observatory, that's the easiest way to find it. If you want to see a list of all the counts that are using Dunkadoo, you can go just to the Dunkadoo website, and I think the link is Explore Projects or something like that. Okay. When you're on their website, it's pretty obvious where to go.
Dunkadoo.
Yes.
Google it, and you won't get many other results if you Google Dunkadoo.
I always thought that the American bittern call was chug-a-lunk, so I'm really offended by this Dunkadoo. I don't know where that's come from, but
apparently it came from New England, so
yeah, it must be like a Midwest versus East Coast thing or something.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah. But I think what's really cool is the data. Both of Brad's location and Alison's location. You guys have like almost real-time data. You have blogs and websites set up where people can kind of follow along, to experience migration a bit, even from afar, which is pretty awesome. But I was going to ask a question. Sorry, Josh, if you don't mind me jumping in. But that this year we've had such a late spring. We've had a lot of cold fronts and east to northeast, even north winds, and I'm sure Whitefish Point spring is much more of a dicey situation in general. But if you're both going to be sort of ending the counts in the next 7 or 8 days, there's still going to be a lot of movements in June this year. No, Brad, you're shaking your head.
Well, I don't know if I can say that because sometimes we see these really cold months like March or April. And then we finally get those south winds, and so you would think that everything would be set back, 2 weeks or a week, and then everything would then be extended out. But sometimes you just see, like we saw last Friday, all these birds were bottled up and all these species were moving at once. And so we were getting things that normally peak out around that date, like Cape May warblers, but we were also getting our first bobolinks and dick thistles those mornings. But instead of just seeing the first one or two, we were getting 150 of them come by. And so I think what you see is just this big rush for everything that comes in at once, and not necessarily extending into middle of June when we might be missing species. Certainly there's going to be some lingerers out there, and if we don't get, as long as we keep getting these southern winds, I don't think necessarily that we will miss a lot of things, because hormones are still driving that migration northwards to breed.
Yeah. So I guess you guys, you're both in places that get quite a few visitors, birders and non-birders alike. So, I came up with lots of questions for you. People in the audience are asking questions. But say a non-birder stumbles up onto the tower and there's all these birds flying around, there's people counting. What are the questions that non-birders ask when they end up on the tower and see this migration count going on?
The Indiana Dunes gets a lot of visitors, especially if we get April, May, where our proximity is right there by the beach. So as it starts to warm up, a lot of folks will wander up there and ask us what we're doing. And, usually we tell them right away that we're looking for whales. And those that we actually don't fool, and we explain the bird migration that's occurring there. And usually there's a lot of interest, and usually everybody has a bird story, something that they've seen or their mom saw. They have an oriole at their feeder. So it's kind of neat to be able to connect. And we have a lot of feeders that are outside the tower too. So we're hosting a lot of orioles and grosbeaks and hummingbirds as well that people can get a chance to see. And because that's been a major part of our count, is not only the research data, but being tied to the Lake Michigan coastal programs where we get some of the grant money. We do post our daily sightings not only on eBird, but through that indianadunesbirding.wordpress.com. So that's where you'll see the daily reports of the birds being seen, as well as the checklist. And so the education component's a pretty heavy part of the Indiana Dunes count as well.
Yeah. And Alison, I guess you had some visitors today that maybe you weren't so pleased with. We mentioned piping plovers at the very beginning of the program, because everyone in Chicago is very fond of piping plovers these days. And
who isn't fond of piping plovers?
That's right. I mean, we had Doug Stotts on the other day, and I think I asked him why piping plovers were so special, and he said because they're so cute, and it's true. But they're really cool birds. And I guess you have piping plovers nesting at Whitefish.
Yeah, we have. In fact, Whitefish Point, the beach there, is a unit now of Seney National Wildlife Refuge. The main unit for that wildlife refuge is further west in the Upper Peninsula, and it's actually an interesting site because it's where trumpeter swans were reintroduced into Michigan. But yeah, so Michigan opened up the Upper Peninsula and part of the northern Lower Peninsula from some of our travel restrictions. That was this Friday that it happened. So with Memorial Day and really nice weather and the lifting of these restrictions, we've had just a surge in visitor traffic. And even though the beach is signed and there's parts of the beach that are very obviously closed, you have a lot of people that I don't know if they're oblivious or they just don't care, or a combination of things. And you'll have unleashed dogs and people just walking through the area where the piping plovers are trying to nest. And it's incredibly frustrating. I've had lots of time this season to think about how to more diplomatically approach these people that are breaking the rules, because I haven't had visitors. So I'm like, my natural tendency is not to be nice when I see people that are using a national wildlife refuge in a way that just flies in the face of why it exists. But I tried very hard this morning to be diplomatic with the people that had unleashed dogs and gave them the benefit of the doubt for maybe not seeing the sign. And they all ended up putting their dogs on leashes afterwards. So there was some positive that came out of that.
Diplomacy sometimes works.
Yeah, I guess you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. But it was actually neat to have visitors out again today, because like Brad was saying, you have that chance to educate people about the point and to just like give them a little window into migration that they might not have any idea of. People can't believe it when I tell them, oh, I've seen a few thousand loons this season, or 300 ducks flew by in the last hour. It's something that is mind-boggling to them, and I think a lot of them walk away thinking that Whitefish Point and by proxy bird migration is a lot cooler than they would have thought otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, it's these places are really great opportunities to educate and spread the joy of birds to the wider world. Brad, are there so Indiana Audubon you're executive director of Indiana Audubon. You guys are involved with sponsoring the Longshore Count. Do you guys have other programs, other projects that are going on in that area? Research, or, I mean, of course, there's the Dunes Festival as well.
Yeah, so, we are doing a few conservation and research initiatives. A lot of the project that we are doing center around our own properties. We have the Mary Gray Bird Sanctuary, which is down in Connersville, east of Indianapolis. So there are a lot of research being done in bird banding there. And so we have both a traditional MAPS banding, which is for a breeding program. We do a spring and fall migration banding project as well. And then it's really become quite known for the hummingbird banding as well. So annually, around 500 to 600 hummingbirds are banded every summer season at that sanctuary. So that's kind of one of the things that we're really most known for. Up in Indiana Dunes, though, we are, as we partner with different organizations, trying to get some more information and knowledge about birding and bird sites. And so we have a brand new property called the Flora Richardson Foundation. And the Flora Richardson is based in Dune Acres, just west of the state park. And they have a nature reserve that they recently acquired in LaPorte County. And so we're helping them get a kind of all-inclusive data set on the birds that are there. So we have someone that's going out there and doing point counts right now, a full 12 months of point counts, so we can kind of build up and see what species are using there. And if we know what birds are there, then we know what sort of management recommendations that we might be able to give if they have prothonotary there and ways they can manipulate the habitat, or any sort of species that are on that property. So we are always kind of looking at different projects around the state that we can help out with. But definitely the Indiana Dunes one, I think, is, and that Longshore Tower is one that I've been most proud of, one that we're learning so much for. Alison mentioned birds migrating earlier. We are working with Dr. Ken Brock, and so he's able to document that migration is in the Dunes area 6 days earlier than it was 30 years ago.
Wow.
And that combination of both our longshore data and just birdwatcher observation that he's been able to collect over the years.
I was just also going to chime in. Indiana Audubon has an amazing program called Adopt a Shrike, in which somebody can adopt an individual loggerhead shrike, which I think is a state listed species. Full admission, I've adopted one. I just recently found out that it hasn't returned yet this year, unfortunately, but you actually get to track an individual bird, which is super cool. So yay to you, Brad, for that program. Also, I was going to add, the dunes are open right now, correct? The lakeshore, or excuse me, the national park and the state park are generally open for visitors right now. Is that right?
So the Indiana Dunes National Park has been one of the fewer ones that have been open. It's a hard one to close anyway, just because of its fragmented nature. But there are some accessibility issues that have occurred. A lot of it's because of beach erosion it's occurring because of the lake levels. But then the Indiana Dunes State Park has remained open. So as long as folks are, I guess, birding responsibly, so to speak, those parks have been open for people to visit. And that's what I think makes us a great birding destination right now with all the COVID issues compared to sites like McGee Marsh in Ohio that, everyone flocks to one boardwalk. Well, here we have 15,000 acres of excellent birding habitat that folks can really space out and explore.
And the Indiana Dunes Festival had to be canceled, of course, for COVID this year, but it'll be back next year.
We will be back, yes.
Which is a great festival, and everyone should go. And it's very accessible if you're in the Chicago area. To change talking points a little bit, the area between, this is going to be for Alison, the area between Indiana Dunes and Whitefish Point, the lower peninsula of Michigan, essentially, is home to another really special bird, Kirtland's Warbler. And you spent some time working in the Kirtland's territory, Alison. What were you doing there? What were you doing, and how was it?
So it was actually my first birding job. Actually had to go home for a day to graduate high school my first season doing it, but I was the Michigan Audubon Kirtland's Warbler tour leader in, let's see, it was 2011, 2012, and then again in 2014. And essentially I took people out into the Jack Pines. It was when the Kirtland's was listed and you had to accompany a tour leader to go out into the habitat. And they still, if it wasn't for COVID this year, they would still be running those tours. But I got to take people from all over the world out into the Jack Pine Flats and show them Kirtland's warbler and their habitat and talk about the management strategies. The other part of my job was managing the brown-headed cowbirds, which were key in the Kirtland's warbler decline, and that part was not quite as enjoyable as leading the tours. In fact, it was quite a bit less enjoyable.
Yeah.
But there were always Kirtland's warblers that were singing next to the cowbird traps, and I always decided to just take that as the Kirtlands thanking me for what I was doing.
Are there Kirtlands breeding up in, I think they're up in the UP. Are they around Whitefish Point now? You mentioned that it was listed, it was a federally listed endangered species. The conservation measures have been really successful, so it was actually removed a year or two ago, which is really great. Maybe we're heading that way with the Great Lakes piping plovers even, but are they up around Whitefish now?
They have been. So their habitat parameters are very narrow. They need jack pines of a certain age, and actually, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we had them as close as like 6 miles away from the point. I think those trees have gotten a little bit older now, and the habitat in the Upper Peninsula is not managed for Kirtland's warblers. So I'm sure that there are some stands of jack pine that are the correct age for Kirtland's that are not far away. I just don't know where they are. And the ones in the Upper Peninsula are not quite as well known and well broadcast as the ones in the lower.
It's a big area to search.
It is. Actually, the first year that I did the Kirtland's warbler census, I was in the county west of where I am at Whitefish Point right now. And they just gave this immense swath of jack pines to survey. And yeah, there's a lot of jack pine in the Upper Peninsula. We did not end up finding any Kirtlands in our survey block, but I'm sure that habitat has had them at some point or another.
Let's see if there's, if we can get Amanda. Have there been questions from the audience, Amanda, that we should be taking?
Yes, the first question came from Lynn. If you want to unmute Lynn, and it's a question for Alison about how long had she been doing counts and how long, or when was the tower built?
Lynn, you are
actually that was for the dunes. I was actually asking Brad because I was curious. Sorry, I was just curious when you really started doing all those counts and when you rebuilt or when you built that really nice platform.
Sure. So originally we had the Greenwater Tower, and that's where the first observations that a longshore flight was occurring. They actually tore down what we call the Green Tower. You might still hear us call it the Green Tower. Don't look for a green tower. It's not green. But they tore down the Green Tower in 2007. And then we almost began immediately after that the construct the tower. It took several years to get it done. As you might realize, working with a state agency and engineering, it went from a $10,000 little wooden platform to I think it ended up being about $150,000 creation because you're dealing with snow loads, wind updrafts coming up that dunes off Lake Michigan. You have to build for 120-mile-an-hour winds. So it's a really strong structure, and I love it because you can have 10 or 15 people on that tower, and you're not going to feel any shaking if you're looking through your scope. So that was built around 2009, 2010. But we had been doing the counts from the staircase going up from the west lot immediately after that. The original Green Tower was tore down. So now we're running through about our 10th year of doing the surveys, and tied with the Lake Michigan Coastal Program, we have 7 years of actual data that's tied to that. So nearly 10 years of data now.
Wow, amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Just 30 more years to go to get to where Whitefish is now.
Absolutely.
It's amazing data. It's just amazing data sets. All right, Amanda.
Sure, the next question is from Scott about how you keep track when you're counting thousands of birds.
All right. I think you said Scott. Scott, can you unmute yourself? Oh.
Maybe we lost Scott.
Maybe we lost Scott. Amanda, you want to ask the question?
Sure, it says, how do you count thousands of birds and how do you keep track to not miss any if you're counting that large number?
Allison, do you want to take it?
Yeah, so it can be a little overwhelming out there, but fortunately the season starts slowly and you have sort of this period of grace where there's not a huge volume of movement and you can get with the rhythms of scanning and recording. And I've been doing this for long enough that it's just something that becomes almost a reflex. You see a flock, you either count the flock or estimate the flock, and you put it down. Like, I don't have to think about it too much anymore. And during the off season, at least up until this summer, I would work in bars, and it's sort of the same thing, keeping your memory going as keeping a bunch of orders in your head at the same time. It's what counting birds is like too. But sometimes I will go through my data at the end of the day. I actually did that today. I was like, what species was it? Oh yeah, I had a solitary sandpiper that flew over during a busy period in the morning, and I had forgotten to record it. So I do make sure when I get home after the count, the first thing I do is go through my data and just do sort of an informal quality control to make sure that I got the numbers and the species that I actually saw.
And Brad, how do you guys have special counting methods?
Obviously, when you run out of fingers, you start using toes. But besides
Only
that,
get to so far.
yeah, you know, we are doing a lot of things old-fashioned, still paper, pen out there. Clickers, you know, we have a lot of clickers, and if you show up on the tower and you're wanting to help out, and it's mid-April and the flickers are flying, you become the flicker clicker. And you know, they're going by in singles and in groups of 8, so they're a lot easier to count. Obviously, the biggest flights like we had last Friday, where there's thousands of warblers going by, chimney swifts and barn swallows and even indigo buntings were getting missed in just the mayhem. So you try your best, and with flocks, as Alison mentioned, you're learning to estimate flock size really quickly. If you know that large birds like geese and such tend to get overcounted, and you're going to undercount smaller flocks of birds, you know, so just you're learning through experience on estimating flock sizes. And so I think that it may not always be an accurate number, but as long as you're consistent, then you're going to be able to measure the trends, and that's what's most important.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, like, just just give us a picture of, like, if it's orioles or indigo buntings, you know, these are land birds. You don't typically associate them with kind of flying vast distances without, like, landing and feeding, are they in the vegetation around you at these sites, or are they just up in the air the whole time? Maybe asking for Brad more because there's more vegetation around you.
Yes, so on top of the tower site, we have several cottonwoods, both to the east and west of us. There's some oaks immediately to the west. So a lot of the things are going by, and you have a short window. A lot of the birds, you know, they'll be coming in from the east and they're flying west. So basically, they're kind of heading into more the westerly wind, which gives them the lift. So you have the opportunity of seeing them come from across the parking lot. If you don't catch a bird till it's right in front of you, you got just a split second before it hits behind the trees, and those birds get unidentified. There are a number of them that like those really tall cottonwoods, and it's just amazing how many things we'll see come in, land, and then take off right at the tower site, almost as if they're prepared to give us a quick 2-second pose and then take off again. And so that really helps out with some of the ID. But there's certainly birds that we're missing just because there are so many trees around us that as soon as they get behind it, we can't identify them.
And I was going to ask you, Alison, like, you're in a more windswept open area. So, like, if you have, I think earlier in the week you had 900 blue jays on a single day. I looked it up on your website or Dunkadoo. Like, were they all just like flying over, you know, and not stopping, or were they pausing like along the shore?
So the land birds at Whitefish Point are generally a little bit different than they are at Indiana Dunes. When they're doing the spring migration and coming from the south or the west, they see the stretch of water between Whitefish Point and Bechuana Bay, and they find it really intimidating. In fact, not just the passerines, the raptors oftentimes will be pretty put off by the crossing. So instead of birds going directly across and just keeping those flight lines going, you'll have them circling around and sometimes landing. And with the flocking birds, and actually, like, it's hard at Whitefish, you get a feel for what's migrating and what's just hanging around, and it's really hard to explain without being next to somebody in the field. But with the blue jays in particular, what I do is I keep track of, like, the most that I see in the air at a time. And that day it happened to be 900. Sometimes it will be really obvious that a new flock has come in towards the end of the count, just because when birds arrive at the point, they act a little differently than birds that have been there for a while. They're more confused and more vocal. They're moving around more. But the blue jay migration here is actually really cool. It coincides with large numbers of sharp-shinned hawks and large numbers of merlin around. And the blue jays will be like towering in the sky. I don't know if they're just trying to get like a high view of the crossing that they have to have or what exactly it is, but they'll be up so high that they're just little specks even in your binoculars. And then they'll catch sight of a merlin or a sharp-shinned, and they'll just drop like missiles out of the sky, and it sounds like a firework almost coming down. That's sort of what it looks like as well, and you'll just be surrounded by hundreds of blue jays dropping for cover. And it's really cool. It can startle you too. Like my first spring season here, the first couple times it happened, the noise was like a little bit startling, but now I just think it's really awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Any other questions, Amanda?
Yeah, so there's a question from Darren Colley about Allison's data.
Darren, you there? Let's see.
Yes, I think Amy answered it. Thanks. I was just curious. I wasn't listening as to actually where your data is posted. And I guess it is on Dunkadoo, and also the other website that Amy that she'd included.
Yeah, so we do a few things with our data. You can find it all on Dunkadoo. At least I think 2017 was the first year that we began to use Dunkadoo. And you can find our data on eBird. We try to post daily checklists, although we do get a bit behind track by this point in the season. And then if you want something that's a little bit more than just numbers, the research programs here in spring, which is owl banding, the hawk count, and the waterbird count, we all post weekly blogs, and you can find that at wpbo.org/blogs.
Thank you.
For sure.
And we're getting up towards the end of our time here. I think I'll ask one more question of each Alison and Brad. I'm going to ask you guys the same question. So let's start with Brad. If people had one weekend where they could go and visit the Indiana Dunes to see the best migration possible there, what time of year, what weekend would you recommend as a can't miss weekend, just because of, well, whatever criteria you want?
That's so close, yeah, because depending on a lot of it's what you want to see. Obviously, in March, we're itching for spring migration and watching the river of blackbirds, the robins, 15,000 robins a day at the end of March and April. And, you're watching all these robins go by, and Brennan used to say, head into a neighborhood lawn near you. What an amazing sight to see. But then April, the new addition of species, but by far, May, first 2 weeks of May, it's bedlam. There's anything new that's coming today. You can see 100 species standing in one spot, such as we had just, last Friday as well. So that would be the most amazing time, because it's during that window at these amazing birding sites on Lake Michigan, whether you're at the Indiana Dunes or Whitefish Point or Point Pelee or Montrose, you never know what's going to fly by. And it's just amazing to think of all the different things that you start kind of just whatever your mind can imagine could fly by is that potential at sites like that. So the first couple of weeks of May is the time that I would say make it up there to watch the early morning flight.
And your site is much more spring focused than fall. Allison has the choice of spring and fall, so it's going to be an even harder decision. Allison, what's the best weekend? What do you think, if people are going to drive up from Chicago or Detroit or wherever for a weekend, what would you recommend?
I would recommend mid-May. We have just a lot of birds across the board peaking then. We have really good hawk flights, particularly for broadwings, which means that sometimes there's a Swainson's hawk along with them, which is pretty cool to see. And a lot of the Swainsons at Whitefish Point are actually dark Swainsons, which is pretty unique. The waterbird count is also, in my opinion, it is the most exciting. During that period, we have our peak scoter flights, our peak long-tailed duck flights, our peak Bonaparte's gulls flights. There's oftentimes a little gull or two that's hanging out with the Bonapartes. In fact, exactly a week ago, we had a night flight where we had 1,400 Bonaparte's gulls in about 2 hours, and we had 2 little gulls with them as well. And that's like at Whitefish Point, I would not come for a peak migration where there's just one species. I want to have as many options as possible, because the weather here is so fickle. You don't want to come up for hawks and have it be just rain and winds. You want there to be an option for water birds too, because they will migrate when it's rainy and windy.
So I guess what you guys are saying is you can start at Indiana Dunes the first weekend and then make your way up through Michigan. And by the second weekend in May, you can be up at Whitefish Point and
Definitely.
good cross section of Midwest migration.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining us. It's been great. As a reminder to everyone, this is a production of This Week in Birding. You can follow us on Facebook. We're going to post video of today's program, and where we post our weekly web shows that Bob and I host. It's also on YouTube under Bob Dolgan. And I'm with Red Hill Birding. You can find Red Hill Birding on Facebook and Instagram. And you can also find the Monty and Rose film on Facebook as well. So thanks everyone for coming. It's been really great. Thank you again, Brad and Allison and Bob and Amanda for helping out and for making for a really interesting evening. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
you. It's been a pleasure.